Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome everyone here in the room today. I also welcome those who are joining us online. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I'm the director of the Africa program here at the Wilson Center. So the Wilson Center, through our Africa program and our partnership with Brown Capital Management, is delighted to host this conversation today on securing Africa's critical mineral wealth, a role for sovereign wealth funds. Really delighted to see several members of the Africa Diplomatic Corps, several colleagues from the US government in the room today. Also want to recognize Dr. Amania Safor, who's joining us today from Cairo. Thank you so much for being here. As the global demand for energy transition minerals continues to grow rapidly, we see that Africa is holding a significant percentage of the world's reserves. However, for Africa's mineral resources to translate to economic growth and real economic wealth, the critical minerals value chain needs to be improved with smart policies, reforms, and investments. In the Wilson Center Africa program, we work to address some of the most critical issues facing Africa and US-Africa relations. And we also work to enhance the knowledge of Africa in the United States. This is why our partnership with Brown Capital Management is very important. Since 2015, our Brown Capital Management Africa Forum has provided a premier platform for solution-oriented dialogue on key trade, investment, and development issues in Africa and on US-Africa relations. Just like our conversation today on sovereign wealth funds and critical minerals in Africa. We're entirely grateful to Brown Capital Management, Mr. Eddie Young, Ms. Sylvia Young, Keith Lee, and BCM's president, Robert L. Young III, who is in the audience with us today. Robert Young has been a strong supporter of the Wilson Center Africa program since he assumed his role as president of BCM in January 2023. Prior to joining BCM in 1999, he served in various senior leadership positions at T. Rowe Price and the Xerox Corporation. Rob, can I invite you to please come up to the podium? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. 2015. It's kind of amazing at this point. I think I was 10 years old or something. As Oge said, my name is Robert Young. I'm president and head of distribution, or we'll say marketing, sales, and client service at Brown Capital Management. And we're a Baltimore-based firm. For those of you who are from DC, Baltimore is not a suburb of the district, although it took about 2.5, 3 hours for me to get here this morning. That should prove it. But on behalf of Brown Capital, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, for those of you in person and online. You know, global demand for critical minerals related to the digital economy and renewable energy is increasing the focus of policy and public discussions. Sovereign wealth funds are an important tool for supporting expanded trade and investment across the continent, but their operations, management, and opportunities are often unfamiliar and opaque to many. Sovereign wealth funds, as you know, are often very complicated in their nature and take a great bit of time to develop. Today, we have an exciting opportunity to learn more about how sovereign wealth funds are ensuring mineral wealth, support, and infrastructure in the development of the continent's economies. Brown Capital is proud to support the Wilson Center Africa program, advance a series of substantive policy conversations on African sovereign wealth funds and how they can accelerate intra-African trade. The series builds on almost, again, a decade, unbelievable, of partnership between the Wilson Center Africa program and Brown Capital Management, focused on in-depth discussions and analysis towards critical U.S.-Africa trade, investment, and development relations. It is the only platform of its kind, which is noteworthy. The needs, challenges, successes, and priorities of African funds. We are excited as this series moves us toward a fourth high-level meeting on African sovereign wealth funds to be held in 2025. This platform is recognized and a trusted partner for government and fund managers to network and share peer learnings and experiences over time. I'm excited by the conversation and by the inaugural Brown Capital Management Public Policy Fellow, Dr. Patrick Utomi, pleasure meeting you, to learn about how the U.S. is working with key partners on the continent on these important issues. So again, my sincere welcome. Thank you all for taking the time. I know we're started a little behind schedule, and Oge made sure that I kept my comments brief and to the point. So thanks so much for taking the time.
Okay, can I invite our panelists to please come up to the stage? While they're coming up to the stage, I also encourage those of you who are behind, if you could also move forward. I'm going to do a really quick introduction of our speakers and moderator. I'm really delighted we have a stellar panel of speakers this morning to dive into this topic on sovereign wealth funds and critical minerals in Africa. On the panel today is Ms. Helena Matza, who is the Acting Special Coordinator of the Office of the U.S. Special Coordinator for the Partnership on Global Infrastructure and Investment at the U.S. State Department. She most recently served as the Director of Energy Transformation at the U.S. Department of State, where she led efforts on clean energy and supply chains. She also previously served as the Director of Climate Diplomacy at the National Security Council in the White House. Also on stage, it's our pleasure today to also welcome Governor Abdullahi Sule, who is the Governor of Nasarawa State in Nigeria. Governor Sule is a Nigerian engineer, businessman, and politician, and has served as governor of Nasarawa State since 2019. He has also held leadership positions in the energy industry and private sector, including serving in senior managerial positions with the Dangote Group from 2007 until his election as governor in 2019. Also on the panel is Dr. Kayode Fayemi. Dr. Kayode Fayemi was a former governor of Ekiti State in Nigeria, where he also served as chair of the Nigeria's Governor Forum. He also served as Nigeria's Minister of Mines and Steel Development from 2015 to 2018. He's currently a visiting professor at the Africa Leadership Center at King's College in London. And Ms. Chipokata Manawasa is the senior policy advisor to the President of the Republic of Zambia. In addition to her role as Senior Policy Advisor to the President, she also serves as the Deputy Head of the Presidential Delivery Unit. Prior to her position in government, she served as an in-house counsel and executive assistant at one of Africa's largest copper mines. And moderating this conversation for us today is our inaugural Brown Capital Management Africa Program Policy Fellow, Dr. Patrick Utomi. Dr. Utomi is a recognized Nigerian political economist and management expert and has served as an advisor to several Nigerian presidents. In the private sector, he was also the Chief Operating Officer of Volkswagen of Nigeria. He also serves as the chair of the African Union's Pan-African Private Sector Trade and Investment Committee. Before we go into the panel, I also want to thank several members of the Africa program, Aaron Stanley, Niat Afewaki, Nathaniel Oakes, and our colleagues from our Environment, Security, and Climate Change program, and our Science and Technology program here at the Wilson Center, all who have been instrumental in helping to plan and work towards this conversation today. And with that, I will turn it to you, Dr. Utomi, to take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Oge. Let me again join my voice in welcome to all of you, to the leadership of Brown Capital Management, and to the President of Africa Business Council, Dr. Amanias, who's flown in for this conversation. There are three levels at which I like to think of the engagement that we're about to make. One is at the general level of the narrative on Africa. The narrative is typically about poverty. Most of you may have seen the besides the Brookings study that moved Nigeria up to the poverty capital of the world, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation study that essentially suggests that between DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nigeria, we could actually have in a few years about 60% of the poorest people on the planet. Yet between DRC and Nigeria, most significant mineral deposits on the planet. How can people be so rich and so poor? And that's what gives essence to the whole sovereign wealth fund idea, and how savings from those can trigger investments, growth of trade across the continent, and therefore quality of life improvements on the continent. In this regard, therefore, I think it's important to talk about the mystery of capital. Where does capital come from? There used to be a professor at Columbia in the 50s, Ragnar Noxe, whose mantra was, capital is made at home. How can Africa make capital at home? What role can sovereign wealth funds play in stimulating this capital that can perhaps de-risk capital from elsewhere entering the continent and drive things? I think that if we just bear those in mind and just finish up with how creative we can be with sovereign wealth funds and the difference that it can make, all of our panelists, in speaking to the various strengths that they bring to this conversation, can please avert their minds to these three levels of challenges, at least that I face in trying to wrap my head around the issues that we are playing with. Let me begin with Helena Malza, who has recently been traveling in the DRC that I just mentioned, amongst other places, and has seen the U.S. government role expanding. If you could please give us a sense for how the U.S. government is leveraging international trade and economic relations to strengthen international partnerships to achieve diplomatic goals of advancing clean energy transition and all of that, subject which I have, incidentally, I've been just discussing this morning with Governor Sule. Please.
Sure, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm very aware that I am one of the only representatives not from the continent, and so I'm here just as much in learning and listening mode as sharing really the approach that the U.S. government has been taking to engage on this incredibly important conversation. So maybe I could just take a step back and share a little bit about how the U.S. government has been thinking about engagement on the continent, but also more broadly on how we support investments in infrastructure and clean energy supply chains, which for us is just as much the downstream, getting solar and wind and taking advantage of a very different type of resource wealth, as it is upstream on all the important critical minerals that go into these technologies. And we really refined our approach during this administration in a couple ways. One was that in partnership with the G7, we came together and said, if some of the largest economies in the world, we're going to work together to actually start driving investment to these critical supply chains, to these important infrastructure needs. Because it's not just about the minerals, it's about the ecosystem around the minerals. It's about the people around the minerals and making sure that they're really sharing in that wealth. And that agenda and how that works isn't defined by us, but by our partners on the ground. And Cheap and I have had plenty of time to work together in Zambia over the last 2 years. And that's really where the concept of the very long title you heard me have was born, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which is a shared commitment to help mobilize $600 billion to close the infrastructure gap in emerging economies around the world. We, as the United States, have said we are going to help deploy $200 billion of those dollars by 2027. But essentially, a new role was created for the U.S. government that we think partners really well with some of the institutions you know from us on the continent, whether that's Prosper Africa, Power Africa, and these very specific initiatives that have been trying to bring more capital investment. What we did is we created a global infrastructure coordinator function. And our job is not only do a better job of coordinating our own system, so bringing our tools, right, whether that's from our Development Finance Corporation, our Export-Import Bank, our USTDA, and actually see how we can help support a project pipeline from beginning to end. And we shouldn't diminish that. That's actually really an important role for DFIs, not just ours, to get better at, because we know that these critical mineral projects take a long time to get off the ground. That when you are thinking about exploration, that's a completely different timeline. That could be a 10 to 20-year horizon than brownfield expansions, than really what I think is one of the most important things to the continent, which is investing in beneficiation. And we see that not just as the processing technologies that's really important, of course, but also thinking about how in different parts of the continent and really around the world that we can create hubs of excellence in not only refining feedstock from multiple locations that go into battery technologies, but also how that training and development works around. So this isn't, once again, ideas that were just born in the United States. They came out of a lot of collaboration and discussion with our African partners, but also around the world. This is a global initiative, and so we're doing similar work in the Philippines, in Central Asia, in South America. But there's a really unique opportunity on the continent. I'm sure you're gonna hear lots and stats and figures, but we know, right, the infrastructure gap in Africa specifically is requiring another additional annual financing of $350 billion across the critical areas that's critical minerals plus, that many of our partners are in the process of restructuring their debt right now. That donors and DFIs are filling in some of the gap, and the work that we're doing on the Libido Trans-Africa Corridor, I think, is a good example of how we're trying to do concessional fundraises alongside really important PPP efforts in these countries, and I hope to talk about it more. But we have some serious issues that we still need to work through. Cost of capital is high. It takes a long time for these projects to get off the ground. So what the role is of sovereign lending, both in the context of our African partners, thinking through how to take advantage of this wealth. I mean, over 1/3 of the world's natural resources are on the continent, paired with how we look at sovereign lending from other partners, those that are investing now increasingly more in critical supply chains, whether that's some of our Gulf partners in QIA or ADQ. There's opportunities now to bring those two worlds together, both on new funds on the continent, as well as that other lending that could be both patient capital, but I think just as importantly, bringing down the cost of the rest of the capital stack, which will be instrumental.
I really want to circle back to you later on that subject. It's a very important subject, but I'd like to go to Governor Sule, who has seen a lithium beneficiation plant commissioned in Nasarawa State, the first, perhaps on the continent, isn't it? And we want to find out how your thinking is flowing towards how the private sector and other partners can collaborate to extend the possibilities of these value chains being developed. Please, a little bit about what has happened in Nasarawa and what you think will get the most bang for the buck, if you will, process.
Thank you very much, Prof. Let me, I think, first and foremost, show great appreciation for the initiative of bringing this idea together, for us here to get together and start thinking about African minerals in general. I'm happy actually to hear from the introduction, exactly where are we going with this. And there is no better time than this. And I think this is apt in the sense that more and more is being known now about Africa's minerals. And then more and more is also being known about those who are interested in African minerals. I was just telling them this morning that I just got back actually from both India and China. And while in China, there is a lot of interest that has been shown, especially in Nasarawa State, because of the huge deposits of lithium that we have, and the huge deposit of the oil that also was discovered recently, where an exploration well is being drilled at the moment. So on the invitation of some of the biggest users of lithium, because today the biggest producer of batteries worldwide is a company called CATL. CATL is also the big supplier to Tesla and most of these other companies that are producing electric cars. So I had the opportunity actually to go to Beijing and then travel all the way to their manufacturing plant, about 2 hours flight actually from Beijing, and had seen what is there and their interest and how they are going around in order to make sure they get to this interest. So now coming back home, I was thinking that Professor Kayode, His Excellency, will have been the first to speak because he was a minister, when I was the group managing director in Dangote before coming in. And then, of course, he was our chairman of the Governors Forum, so we called him Governor General before he did that, So I came in with the idea that how come Nasarawa State has this huge percentage of minerals, and indeed we are being called home of solid minerals. That's the name of Nasarawa State. And yet we are not seeing any impact about it. So on assumption, office in 2019, when I was sworn in, the first ministry I went was actually the ministry that he managed, of solid minerals. And I said, I want to know how many licenses had been given in Nasarawa State to those who are going to mine in Nasarawa. And they told me 416. I said, then I want to know how much Nasarawa State has been able to receive, from this, that. They say, well, we don't even know what is being produced, what is being mined, and things like that. So that was the beginning of my crisis, and I knew then there was a problem. So I was very happy when she mentioned there has to be a policy on ground that will come out to say that these are the minerals, how do we actually benefit from these minerals by coming back to her point of the ecosystem without affecting, the environment. My background is oil and gas. Actually, I went to school here at Indiana State, and then after that, I live in Texas where I work for the IOCs. I worked for Amoco before we were bought over by BP. So I'm very familiar about the devastation that has been caused by oil and gas operations, especially in Africa, because I had the opportunity to be part of the team, that we are going to most of these African nations looking for oil fields on behalf of Amoco and then later on behalf of BP. And I saw the devastation, and I saw all the environmental issues. So I did not want that to happen again in the area of mining. So we were smart enough to come out with a law. We call it executive order in Nigeria. So we came up with that executive order. And that executive order was saying that, okay, the federal government has the right to the minerals, and they have the minerals. But there is a law in Nigeria that says all the land belongs to the state. So before getting to the minerals, you have to go to the state. So what do we do then? So we came up with the order to say that before you get to the minerals, please, we want to make sure that whatever you mine from there, and I know Mrs. Jack Rich is going to look at me on this one, so whatever you are going to do on that, we want you to be able to process it, in the country, in our own environment, so you can generate the employment opportunities, so you can protect the environment, and so our people can also learn the technology that is in it. So that's when I first came up with this executive order, there were all kinds of criticisms in the country and everything there. But after a while, the Chinese companies in particular that have shown great amount of interest in the minerals in Nasarawa State now started coming to find a way of working together, of partnership. And needless to say, that's where he came up with this idea now to say that instead of taking these minerals, out of Nasarawa State and leaving the whole area for environmental concerns down the line, they just extract only the mineral. Nasarawa State has one of the best lithium concentrate in the country, but only 10% of it is lithium. So if you have 100 trucks, only maybe 10 trucks are lithium. The remaining 90 trucks that you are going away with, you can actually reclaim the land with that kind of area, so that you can now be able to do something with the land. So by this order, it gave that opportunity. And the companies have now shown interest. That's when the first lithium processing plant was now established and commissioned by President Asuwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu recently, where it is going to be processing 4,000 tons of lithium a day. And by doing that, the company now has actually catapulted Nasarawa State from a state that was completely unknown, to a state that is now being invited worldwide. I just got another invitation to Korea this morning by the gentleman. And those are the things that are actually going on. So just to give you an idea so you can understand the importance of this event and why I had to actually rush to come. The study that has shown recently in the UK that we visited, Nigeria, only Nigeria, not even Africa, only Nigeria has over $700 billion worth of minerals that have not yet been exploited or developed. Nigeria has only 40 billion barrels of oil, Because when I worked for the oil and gas company, we used to say Nigeria is a gas country with oil. Because Nigeria has over 220 standard cubic feet of gas reserves. And until recently, even in his hometown, they were flaring the gas, polluting the entire environment. People just coming with all kinds of diseases that nobody knew where the disease came from. So that's why, in fact, I was so excited to hear what she said about the ecosystem, protecting the environment and the rest of that. So today we are going more and more. By next week, I'm going to commission another 10 mining and processing company in Nasarawa State. And we are also going in the process another 18,000 metric tons of lithium processing plant, and then the lead processing plant, and then the cobalt processing plant. All of them are now being built, in Nasarawa State. So the good news is in every state of Nigeria, there is one kind of mineral or the other. There is no state that is zero. In fact, my arrival, there being an oil and gas person, my first interest was in the oil and gas. So I was told we had oil and gas in Nasarawa State, so we pursued it. And when we pursued it, now we're having the drilling operation going on where a discovery of over 1 billion barrels already there in Nasarawa State. But you see, my interest now is no longer in that oil. My interest is more in the minerals, because that is where you are going to be able to build your factory as quick as possible and then create the impact necessary and then...
Good. So I'm going to circle back to you to
yes.
begin that a conversation.
Yes, sir.
But let me very quickly go to Ms. Wanawasa. Where mineral deposits makes the heart bleed, comes clear, not just in the troubles of Nigeria, but clearly in Zambia's current economic state, the challenges with all that wealth of copper. Can you give us some insight into how, the mineral wealth in Zambia has been managed such that we are in the kind of economic straits that we are in with such wealth?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this very important topic and panel. So yes, it's important to recognize that there are challenges around having an economy that is highly dependent on one commodity, anchoring one commodity, which is copper for Zambia. And this, we could talk about the volatility of the economy in that global copper price changes obviously affect the local revenue and exchange rates. And without diversification in the economy, you are impacted by this. But we need to flip the coin, because there lies also an opportunity, and I want us to focus more on that and what Zambia is doing to take advantage of where the world is right now. And we should make no mistake, copper is the future. And make no mistake, critical minerals are the future. And I say this because critical minerals are key with where the global energy and technology transition is going. This is not just with the well-spoken about electric vehicles, but even in technologies such as AI, we're talking about critical minerals. In fact, global demand for copper is projected to increase to 70% by 2050. And also critical minerals demand is also projected to increase almost sixfold by 2040. So countries, African countries with mineral wealth are actually very well positioned, and Zambia plans to be part of the leading countries in this global development around mining and adding value to critical minerals. So what is Zambia doing? Just as early as July 2024, Governor Sule was talking about the importance of having policy documents and strategies. 2024 July, Zambia launched its critical mineral strategy. We also launched our 3 million metric tons copper strategy. The 3 million metric tons is the strategy that's supposed to lead us to increase our copper production threefold by 2031. In addition to that, just last month, August, the president flagged off a national geological mapping exercise to map the entire country, because we believe only about 50% of the country was mapped, and that was much further in history, about in the 1970s. So we actually don't know what we are sitting on, and we believe this mapping exercise is going to change the tide, because there'll be more predictability in terms of exploration, both for the large-scale mining and also for small-scale artisanal miners. So this is what Zambia is doing, and that's not just on the extraction side. Zambia has also embarked on designing the electric vehicle value chain, and we are also working to open up connectivity spaces with Helena. If anyone was wondering what she was referencing to, Zambia is part of the renowned Lobito corridor that's connecting DRC, Zambia, and Angola in the region. And this is a rail and road infrastructure project, mainly that's supposed to enable these minerals to be able to move across the various countries where they are needed for further value addition. In particular, I'll highlight the relationship Zambia has with the DRC. We have an MOU to develop the electric vehicle value chain, and between us, we have some of the largest lithium, nickel, and manganese deposits in the world. So there's no way all those minerals can just be going out in raw form. They have to have value addition and processing. So that's about where Zambia is at the moment in the story of critical minerals.
By the way, if I just joke, I was teasing Governor Sule yesterday about the need to stretch the Lobito corridor to come through Cameroon and arrive in Nasarawa State. You know? But it's really true. We've got to think, just like we think development, I like to think in terms of megalopolises, development corridors. But anyway, let me turn to the Governor General for now and to say to him, you have had to play the role of subnational leader, state governor. You have played the role of a cabinet minister responsible for one of those attributes that creates problems in federal structure, mineral deposits. Perhaps you can help us get a sense of how our thinking should be going if we're to be more effective, especially since savings can be made. Governor Sule was talking about signature rights that were quietly being paid to Nasarawa by some of the explorers of lithium and all of that. If we're not careful, some nationals are going to go as wild as some national governments have gone, and we don't capture that wealth into a savings base that can help, particularly, in my view, de-risk other capital coming from elsewhere to drive development. Please share with us your experience on this very tricky space.
Thank you, Pat, and it's good to be back here again at Wilson Center. You hit on the right point when you talked about a broader approach to engaging this, perhaps a continental approach. And the continent actually developed, when I was minister way back, the Africa Mining Vision. And the Africa Mining Vision talks specifically about ownership, about dealing with the environmental degradation that almost always comes with mining, and ensuring that the various strata of relationships between the communities where these mines are located, the subnational entity responsible for those communities, and then the federal. Sometimes this is mediated by the structure of the country itself. If you were to take our own country, Nigeria, mining is a matter on the exclusive list of our constitution, meaning it's the business of the federal government. But just as Governor Sule rightly identified, land is in the exclusive preserve of the subnational leader, the governor of the state. So if you're going to access your mineral resources because you have a license from me as mining minister, and you think you can just go and ride roughshod in those communities, which happens because you're protected by law to do that. without striking a relationship with the subnational entity, the government. I mean, the law says you can have community agreements, so you can jump the hoop, ignore the state, and go to the community, pay some local chief, and then exploit their resources. But you are not protected, because this then results in community conflicts, a lot of communal conflicts over who owns that particular land that has produced these humongous mineral resources. And the state that could help you mediate that problem is totally excluded from the process. So what we did as a way of managing that in Nigeria was not just depending on the law. I mean, most countries in Africa now have fairly robust mining and mineral resources laws. They have. And they come with the right incentives that are globally recognized. The challenge almost always comes with enforcement of that. And you have that challenge if you don't have shared ownership of the resources that are there. So one of the ways we went about that was to start, during my tenure as minister, a National Council on Mining and Mineral Resources, where states and the federal government and the private sector actually get together annually to review their interests on this. Two, to extend what was already available to oil and gas states in Nigeria, the derivation principle. President Buhari then allowed us to extend derivation principles to mining as well. So in Nigeria today, states can also benefit from the, I think 13%, the same standard 13% that applies to oil and gas is now, if you produce limestone or produce whatever you produce in your state, the Revenue Mobilization and Fiscal Commission responsible for this also makes available a percentage of that resources to you as a state. And we do that as an incentive to encourage states to get more involved. And in order to address the question of exclusivity of mining rights belonging exclusively to the federal government, we then worked out a relationship, and I think the executive order that Governor Sule talked about took advantage of that as well. We worked out a relationship whereby states, yes, are not allowed to be involved in mining, but there is nothing that says that states cannot incorporate private sector entities. So we encouraged all of them to set up companies under the Nigerian laws and then enter into joint venture partnerships with mining corporations like these Chinese that he highlighted in order to become active players. They can then get minority shareholding within that framework. We also, talking about sovereign wealth fund, we then tested that with phosphate. We got the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority involved with the OCP in Morocco in order to support phosphate development in Sokoto and I can't remember which other states where we did this. And as a result of that, a lot of our companies got involved in blending of phosphate for fertilizers in the agri sector. But even with all of the good intentions that this brings, I think the key to addressing all of these issues that we have is to get a critical mass of African countries, because all of these things we're talking about, 90% platinum, 75% cobalt, 40% copper, half of the gold deposits in the world in Africa, all of these things don't produce the benefits to the continent. And it is because we allow ourselves to be divided. We end up being many on the table for these investors who come from outside, rather than a concerted effort in which, okay, Zambia, you have copper, Zimbabwe, you have copper, Namibia, you have copper. Can the three of us come together and insist that in order for you to access our copper, you will do beneficiation, value addition, environmental protection, and then economic diversification of all these mineral resources, regardless of where you come from, China, America, whatever. I think that's one level
Yeah, let me,
that we
push
need
you,
to
let
do.
me push you further on that, because it's a very important area that gets my hormones going.
I'm glad. And it's a reality because in Africa, very few of our financial institutions, and that's why the Sovereign Wealth Fund you mentioned is critical.
Right.
When I was minister, only one bank was interested in mining support in the entire country. Only one bank. And I convened a meeting of all the banks and said, why aren't you supporting mining? They said, no, exploration takes forever, and at the end of it, we don't know whether we're going to get results or not. 20 years down the line. They don't want to get involved in that.
I want to take it down, corridors, since we're talking Lobito corridor and corridors. Aggregation across borders is one of the reasons Africa's participation in global trade is low.
Absolutely.
Because we're very fractured economies. If the AU, with policies, Afro-Exim Bank and others supporting those kinds of initiatives, can manage to organize private sector Africa, collaborating across borders to aggregate across borders, set standards across borders, and access global trade, we could be more competitive. The question is, why is the political will not coming fast enough to make those kinds of things? Because the benefits are so obvious. Again, picking it back on this, the financing challenges, because part of the question is financing. Australia, most of the public infrastructure in Australia today is put there by the mining companies.
Yes.
It was later converted to public infrastructure, but it started as private infrastructure. Even in the United States, go down Florida to all those rail lines. Why
me
are
bust your
these
bubble.
mining companies not able to do the same thing in Africa? So the Lobito corridor with all those lines that she's working on.
I think we're responsible. It's failure of leadership on our part. There's no question about that. Because we are always dependent on being fragmented by the externals. Instead of insisting, for example, all of our leaders have just returned from FOCAC. It was in China too. So, China has its own strategy. It has its own plan.
You had to tick
They call all of us to Beijing. We sit down, sign individual agreements. We did not meet as a collective at the African Union before going to China. So the US does the same thing, brings all our heads of state here. We did not insist that, look, hang on a minute, President Biden, thank you very much for this initiative. But you know what? We want you to come to Addis Ababa, our capital. Bring this agenda that you have and let us discuss it holistically and see where Zambia fits, where Nigeria fits, but without allowing you to play us against each other. I think it's leadership. And that's what the African mining vision actually says. But are we implementing it? It's like AFL-CIO, I said AFL-CIO, AFCTA, Continental Free Trade Agreement. All of these things have been thought through. African leaders have subscribed to them. We've ratified them. And then nothing happens until the quote and unquote do-gooder comes from America or from China or from somewhere. And there's no do-gooder. There's no free lunch. If they're going to say, we want to support you, 50 billion on the table, clearly there's something in it for them.
Mutual benefits.
And we think they're doing us a favor. We need to reorient ourselves, especially with the global shift from a unipolar world in which America used to be completely dominant to a multipolar world. But that can only work if we get our own act together as Africans and define what our priorities are.
Okay, well, I think it's an appropriate point for me to go back to Helena because it's with her corridor.
No, I'm not targeting Elena. I'm just talking generally.
I mean, with her corridor, she really can manage a lot. But how are we mobilizing the necessary level of capital that's required to make this really work? You know, really.
That's the key.
It's a great question. It's hard to answer after following that comment, which I just want to reflect on a few things you said, because I think they're really important. For a long time, the United States, the G7, we've had a narrative that was a huge part of our economic policy about raising the bar, raising the competition, trying to ensure that we have an opportunity to work with our partners on making investments easier so we can bring in more diversified partners. And I think something that we learned during our Africa Leader Summit earlier this year is that we have to have that conversation about the enabling environment, about the capacity development, alongside the very real conversation about getting investment in infrastructure today. And how do we bring those conversations together? And I agree, the continent has a huge opportunity. If through your different organizing groups, you're able to come to some alignment on how you want to govern your shared mineral wealth, which is really hard. It's hard for any combination of countries to do. Sending a unified message to the world is going to be really helpful. And you're right, you have a huge opportunity. I mean, my bosses may slap my hand, but economic competition should be good for the continent, right? In one way, you push some partners who have traditionally moved slow to move faster. You also push other partners who maybe had a more extractive relationship with your continent now to match the same types of investments that we're talking about here with the Libido Corridor. And you're right. I mean, look, there's conversations about getting the African voice on the Security Council, on the AU joining the G20. These are all incredibly important conversations to bring that voice together. And so I think what we see with the Libido Corridor is it's one of our first attempts to pilot a response to that request. But it's one of what will have to be many to be ultimately effective. And so let me just take a step back and explain what the corridor is, and that you're totally right. The idea is to not just land with our wonderful partners in Zambia, DRC, and Angola, but to think through how we can contribute to the vision coming from the continent on Trans-Africa connectivity. Knowing the United States isn't going to be the only investor, the only entity. In fact, one of the ways to bring the Tanzanians on board may be connecting to infrastructure that's being refurbished by completely different countries, like the Chinese. It may involve thinking about additional routes and connectivity to the central corridor that is quite well governed. And I think what we're trying to show is as the United States and as the G7, that as long as the same values we're putting into our investments are upheld in these other investments, we're open for that conversation. But the idea of the Libido Corridor, once again, was not ours. The government of Zambia, the government of DRC, the government of Angola came together in thinking through how they were going to promote more connectivity about those among those three countries. In fact, President Hichilema famously reminded us that, being landlocked doesn't have to be landlocked. You could be land-linked, and you can take advantage of the role that a central connectivity can play. And so, obviously, this is a huge mission, and we certainly couldn't be successful if we bid it all at once. And so, starting really with the beachhead in Angola, with the opportunity, because the Angolans put the Benguela rail line, which starts at the port of Lobito and goes to the border of DRC, up for competitive bid. This is how U.S. business, is how Western business generally participates in these opportunities. And when that happened, we were able to encourage people to participate in that process. And through a fair tender process, in this case, it happened to be that a Western consortium won that bid. And we were able to use our Development Finance Corporation to help finance that rail refurbishment, the first leg of what this connectivity could look like. And then at the same time, working with our partners in the DRC government on how we can bring that refurbishment further into Kolwezi. Well, our Zambian partners did not hesitate to say, you're missing part of the picture. And if we were going to connect Zambia in a meaningful way, these are a couple ways that we, or you, thought it could look like. And it's not one project, it's many projects. It's improving border, one-stop shop harmonization. It's feeder roads. It's now what I think has famously become the Libido Corridor, the 800 kilometers of greenfield rail that we are working with our European partners, with the Italians who just committed $320 million out of their own Plan Mattei to bring to this project to help de-risk and provide the initial financing for a project that we think for us is once in a generation. New rail is really hard to build. And once again, how to do this can't be all done on one side. If we didn't have the Angolan government in this case and the Zambian government as strong partners willing to design and support concession arrangements and think through ways to design this project that we can bring investors along, we wouldn't be able to. And the way that we structured this piece, and I should just also note, the Libido Corridor is not just the rail. The rail is the backbone. We've already financed $1 billion of clean energy deployment in Angola. We have another $1 billion from microgrids coming. We have an MCC compact that we're developing for our partners in Zambia. There's a lot more to this. In fact, with a very small amount of money provided by our US aid, we've been able to bring more mobile banking along the corridor, which not only subsistence female farmers are utilizing, but are connecting, in this case, with the Angolan largest food producer and connecting their business opportunities all along the corridor to get back to the market in Luanda. So backbone infrastructure is important. Being able to leverage the commodities that can help you commercialize that investment is really important. But it doesn't have the value it needs to have if it doesn't actually affect communities and provide not just a practice to move the critical minerals around the region and hopefully with beneficiation into global markets from more diverse routes, but if it doesn't support actual trade coming in and regional trade, especially in agribusiness, which we know needs that additional connectivity to be able to bring routes down from 45 days to 40 hours, you have a whole new game of like what regional agricultural development can look like. Right. But I know you asked me a financing question. I promise to answer it. One of the ways that we're testing out this particular model is by developing with a private project developer, in this case AFC, a mechanism that allows different donors to be able to provide capital on the front end, and then of course after we get the feasibility results, which we will be receiving quite soon. This way we were able to expand a debt facility for that company. We're talking with the World Bank, who is trying to see what their contribution maybe could be, not to put them on the spot. AFDB has expanded its envelope with Zambia for a big contribution, 500 million, a good portion of that going to this project. Like I said, the Italians have decided to take a position of partial equity and debt into the project. A lot of this money, with the MDBs aside, are going to the developer to make this project work, meaning it's going to endure past all of us in our particular government positions, because it's a project that is being monetized, yes, with some initial concessional capital and help, and of course the expansion of other donors coming in, but with the end result to make this project actually operational and commercial.
Well, very, very good. I'm going to very quickly go to the audience, take 2-3 questions, and return to this panel. And since we have the president of the Africa Business Council who's working on this sector, and actually is actually hosting a meeting in Cairo in a few weeks on that, Dr. Mani asked for just a quick 1 minute. We'll start with you. Yeah, you can sit, on the microphone. Yeah, okay.
So thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Thanks for Prof. Tutomi and Wilson Center. So I have heard very much the panelists, as Africa Business Council that is established by the heads of states, especially for what you have been saying to be the voice of the African private sector. And we have among our clusters, 25 clusters, trade, investment, energy, and mineral resources development. So just last summit, we have, as African Union, already launched the Africa Green Mineral Strategies and the Africa Green Mineral Observatory, which starts really by all the mapping exercise of what's existing on the continent, because this is our first step towards really doing that. So we are organizing the CAMRAD, which is the Congress for African Mineral Resources Development. And the main theme, just like your ex have just said, is fostering local content, beneficiation, and value addition to realize the Africa Mining Vision and the Africa 2063 Development Agenda. So we are inviting you all to come because it will be in Cairo from 11 to 13 November. All information is www.camrad.org. But what we're trying to do really is to see how the whole intervention within the whole issue of minerals. As you rightly said, with electrical vehicles, now there is 16.5 million electrical vehicles in the whole world. By 2030, there is expected a global expansion, 350 million electrical vehicles. Who is going to manufacture the lithium batteries? So our strategy really for this, call it the triad of empowerment, 3 pillars. The first pillar is private sector strengthening, including SMEs, women and youth, because during the community, just last week, we had a partnership in Uganda. There is 3,000 to 5,000 small-scale miners that is working in the critical minerals. We need to see how we really protect and have ESG, which is the environmental, social governance, with inclusive sustainability. Because what's happening to the miners there, they just mine, they give it to the licensed company, no protection for them, no environmental sustainability. There is no really regulation for this. So this is from the bottom down, how we really protect the communities. The second really pillar is about the policy. How do we are able to, the incentives that given for the multinational companies can also be given to the African private sector with reference to the whole rural sector. A third pillar really is about product development, how we equip with the technology for the private sector, African private sector, to see how we are able to have local beneficiation and value addition. Of course, transport and infrastructure is huge. So as Africa Business Council, we are really happy to see how we collaborate our efforts and invite you all to this Camrad, so we are able to unify our position, because that's the whole issue. We're fragmented. In Africa, we don't have a unified position with reference to the government and the private sector.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's so important for us to think in terms of value chains. Madam, yes. And then I'll go, okay. Yes, please.
Good morning. Thank you so much
Okay,
for this
welcome to the
opportunity. My name is Roby Kakonge, and I'm Uganda's ambassador to the U.S. Currently, we are tasked with the economic and commercial development, and the key areas are agriculture, tourism, mining, development. So that's the reason that I'm here, is to begin to connect and see within the private sector and other avenues how this conversation is critical. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I put on another hat. Please, let's go to the back there while the microphone is traveling down there. My hat as chairperson of the Africa, of PAFTRAC, the Pan-African Trade and Investment Committee, is really trying to get private sectors around Africa to be able to come together in terms of a vision, a clear strategy of how they can collaborate and cooperate. But I'll get a chance to talk about that perhaps with you later. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Eddie Lechuku from New York, President of Global Initiative for African Advancement. My good friend, Governor Sule, when I came to Lafayette in 2019, I saw firsthand that he is a person that is very interested in bringing in investors into his state. But I have a question. I worked very closely with the African Union ambassador to the United States, the immediate past one, Arikana Chihombori. And we were invited to Portugal, where I went to speak in a conference, international conference. About 2,000 people were there, about 6 presidents, about 3 of them from Africa. And the former president of Portugal was speaking. He mentioned Asia, he mentioned the United States, he mentioned everywhere else. He never mentioned Africa. So in an international conference. So after that, I went to him and I said to him, this is an international conference. I traveled from the United States to be here on behalf of the African Union. Can you please tell us why Africa was not mentioned while you were speaking? And he said one of the most funny, just for lack of a better word, he said, we don't do business with Africa because Africa is closed. That was what he said. So when we're talking about difficulty in doing business with Africa and the man over there who spoke earlier said it's us that we have to blame. I think we have to critically look at the international community to see how we can collaborate with them. If someone in an international conference is saying that Africa is closed for business, that is worrisome, to say the least. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'll take somewhere there, and then I'll come here, and then I'll return to the panel. We might get another round, chance to go back to the right here.
Thank you, and good morning. Aziz Rami, I'm a reporter for the Moroccan Press Agency. I have a question for Mr. Fayemi. You and other panelists spoke about this Lobito corridor, which is certainly an example for cooperation and sharing, wealth sharing in that area. There's also another similar project, which is the, as you know, the Nigeria-Morocco pipeline, which will connect ultimately, I think, 13 or 12 countries from West Africa into Europe. Partners, this is a huge, as you know, this is a huge project, I think about $25 billion. And partners are presenting it as another example for cooperation, for prosperity, for consolidating stability in that region, and for wealth sharing. Can we have your insight on this project? Since I know you certainly was involved in the discussions before its launch. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I'll return. Okay, let me take that gentleman before I then return to the panel.
Good morning. My name is Obi Emekekwe. I run Del Reef Consult. I like that Dr. Fayemi brought up the idea of political leadership and failure of leadership in terms of the challenges that we face in Africa. And if you look at it critically, we really can't go anywhere if we don't have that leadership coming from at the political level in Africa. So my question to you really is, what steps do you think that we should be taking to get the kind of leadership that delivers the result that we are looking for? You know, having played a role in this in the system all along.
Well, thank you. What I will do is I'll get the panelists to make remarks and add response to questions as they are making remarks around perhaps the question I shall ask them. I'll go to Chipo next and say to her, well, you know, the challenge, the burdens that these pressures bring on us are enormous. But if we got more investment-friendly, investor-friendly, could we be more effective as a continent? He says, somebody said Africa is closed for business. Is that Africa's reality? How can we begin to turn these narratives around? Because there are narratives that make the perception of risk for investing in Africa so much worse than they should be. You know, you can feel free to respond to any of the questions, issues raised by the questions as you take that on.
Thank you very much, Prof. In fact, I kept on moving to the edge of my seat as the narrative was changing in the room. But I want to pick it up from the point of land linked and your question about aggregation and connectivity. Not all is lost actually on the African continent, particularly in my neighborhood where I'm coming from. Zambia is open for business and Africa is open for business. And the connectivity and aggregation that you are talking about, Prof, and I'll give Zambia as a case study and the SADC region, what's happening there. So other than the Lobito corridor, we have the other corridor, which is the Tazama, both the pipeline and Tazara rail, which is being rehabilitated between China, Tanzania, and Zambia. We also have energy connectivity currently happening on the continent. We're developing the Tanzania-Zambia interconnector. The Southern Power Pool interconnector between Zambia, South Africa, and Malawi is also being rehabilitated and making it have bigger capacity. We have the Mozambique-Zambia interconnector. You have the Angola-Zambia interconnector. Why is Zambia being mentioned so much? Because Zambia sits right in the center of SADC. So it's land-linked, to all these countries. And you can see the collaboration and deliberateness to make sure that we are all connected through energy, which is important for the mineral value chain, through road and trade border infrastructure, and also through telecoms as well. So now, as to who's responsible for all this work, is it that the African leadership has failed us, or we have failed ourselves as a people? Okay, we can't necessarily lump this responsibility on governments alone. When we talk about raising capital that is being spoken about here, there is capital on that continent. We've heard that there's sovereign wealth funds on the continent. Are these sovereign wealth funds also putting in money into these projects? Why can't the Nigerian sovereign wealth fund invest in any of these corridors in SADC if they're bankable projects, for instance? And also, capital is at different levels. So you have that scale capital. But when you talk about aggregation, so for the Lobito corridor or any corridor to be viable in terms of trade, you need aggregation centers, for instance, for agriculture, okay? That will need also a logistics chain also that's developed. Those are things that private sector, not necessarily just at bilateral level, private sector on the continent can also participate in. So aggregation needs connectivity. Connectivity needs the incentive to be able to invest in that connectivity infrastructure. So it needs that aggregation. So the farmers also need to club together, to make a case for road infrastructure to be viable, so that the PPP projects that, for example, Zambia is utilizing as a mode of infrastructure, even as we get out of our debt situation, is that the president has directed that we will do a significant amount of PPP projects because these are off the balance sheet, and we've just commissioned a several number of roads in the country that are being financed by the private sector, and they'll get back their money through toll gates and other innovative packages, if you like that. And that's private sector money. So I think we should take a bit of responsibility as citizens also of the continent and apply ourselves and do what we can to actually transform Africa. I just thought I could add that.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important point to make there. The Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto keeps reminding us of the mystery of capital. But beyond representational systems, making debt, making wealth that is there on ground, assets, become fungible and become capital, there are institutional arrangements like the Sovereign Wealth Fund that can be properly channeled as a base for actually de-risking the flow of capital on the continent. Because everybody keeps saying, the problem is private sector can't participate because no financing. But the possibilities are enormous. It's just that the institutional weaknesses affect those things. And that's where I moved to Governor Sule. I love the idea of being land-linked versus being landlocked. Governor Sule is land-linked.
Unlocked.
Unlocked. But you're sitting there with the capacity to be a great hub. How does the hub possibility for a Nasarawa state get utilized to drive, the Sunny Minerals industry, value chains? And we must learn to think in value chains now, not just, there's gold here and they come and mine and take off. How do you take advantage of being linked in being a hub to build these value chains for solid minerals? And how can you even save from all this money that you are now making to have a subnational sovereign wealth fund that can facilitate infrastructure development to link you better with these other lands to which you are land linked?
Thank you very much, Professor. Let me first address the issue of ease of doing business, and I think Africa is a dead end, or whatever title that was given by the Portugal leader. I come from the background of investors, both from the point where I work for Amoco, and I had the opportunity actually to go to the Ukraine at the time, the Poltava region, Niger Delta, and then other African countries looking for oil. So even with the war in Angola, Amoco and BP were interested over there. Even with all the challenges that we are having in Africa today, sir, the Chinese government committed $50 billion that is going to come to Africa during the China-Africa. So if true investors are interested, they will go. So the idea of saying that Africa is a dead end or this and that, I think it only applies with due respect to whatever country that had made, or the individual that had made that statement. So I agree with her when she said Africa is open for business. We just had our investment summit, and we had people from all over, coming to that summit and making these kinds of investments. So once you have the opportunity for investors, investors would go. There is no doubt about it. When I worked for Dangote, we went to 14 African countries to make investment, in one place or the other. In fact, one of the biggest investments we made at the time was actually going to Congo. Because I remember before we were entering Congo, we were telling Alaji Aliko Dangote, going to Congo, there is war in that country. He said, that's the reason why we have to go and establish cement plant. Because after the war, there will be destruction. After destruction, there will be reconstruction. There will be reconstruction, and that's where you sell the cement. So I think from all the conversations I Prof, you will notice that we do understand our challenges. We are beginning to know where our challenges are, and we should be able to address them. So I do agree with her once more when she said the leadership is not just the problem. The followership is also a problem. And I give you a very good example again in Nasarawa state. Before we came out with this executive order, a little company from China called Lidl came into a very little community that had never seen 5 million naira. Because of the level of minerals they saw there, they actually came to the community and promised them 200 million naira, and after that, they gave them another 500 million naira. So the people ended up with 700 million naira, a very little community, and a community of not more than maybe 200 people. So when I started seeing the number of people paying for Hajj, people paying for this, going to that, I knew something was going on wrong. And that's why we came in and we started discussing with them, and we discovered the problem there. And so when we came with the executive order, it's the same community that were fighting the governor, that this executive order is going to make these people to leave our state, and they are not going to give us money again. And this, so I was fighting my own people, in the state, because they are not just dividing the heads of our leaders, they are also using the opportunity to do it at that level. And in most cases, investors take advantage of whatever situation that they have. I mean, governments at those levels may not, but investors will actually do. They will exploit if they have the opportunity to do that. So I think it's very important that we keep having programs like this, where we come and discuss our challenges and then take over. I like the question by one of the gentlemen also when he said, Dr. Fayemi, now that we have the problem of leadership, how do you solve the problem? I'm sure Dr. Fayemi will say, okay, vote for me for president when we come to 2027, and you will solve your problem. Those are the kinds of challenges that you will see. So not to put him in this kind of situation, the challenge really is, it's not just the leader. It goes down beyond the leader. It goes all the way through, and we have to take it and understand that these are our challenges. You talk about funding. And I think everybody I heard talking about financing, the banks don't want to do exploration. Of course, no bank will do exploration. Even in the oil and gas, no bank is interested in exploration because they are managing the shareholders' funds. They have to declare some kind of dividends for the people. So they are not going into exploration with all the risks that are there. So that's why you have to look for something else and how to do that. Who is going to do exploration? People like the Shell, the Exxon, the Mobil. Why are they doing exploration? Is because they already have budgeted for it, and they can afford to do it, and they can lose all that money because, say in the oil and gas, for instance, just hiring a rig, going into one field, you can spend $150 million, and you can lose the entire $150 million. No bank can afford to do that. So knowing the risk involved in it, we have to find ways around, to do that. Come to Professor Tommy and say, Pat, help us with $50 million from there. We are going to go into our community to do this. And then he does that. Then go to the Africa Summit. This is what, these are the kinds of things that will happen. And we must be able, to say we are going beyond the talk. We talk about it, we find solutions to it, and then we approach the solution for the implementation. We come with the reform, we manage the reform. And there is the big elephant in the room that we are not talking about, security. Every time you talk about minerals, you talk about security. Today, we are spending close to 7 to 10% of our income. And by the way, we are making more money now than when Fayemi was our chairman. So the moment he left as the chairman, all the states started getting more money. So that's what it is. So there is no money now, and we are spending, believe me, 7 to 10% of our money only on security. Because the moment there is minerals, there is security. So I think in the agenda, we have to include security as a challenge, because that's what it is. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. And it piggybacks into something that I see us struggle with. I think in 1985, the Aga Khan Foundation sponsored a conference in Nairobi on a tripartite approach to governing, where the private sector, the social enterprise sector, and the public sector act literally as equal partners focused on development. That has been a missing part of the effort. That's how the Nigerian Economic Summit Group started. But we have not done that enough, and that has been a drag on checking on these things. We really need to focus more on that. I'll get back to the Governor General to deal with that question in one quick second, but I have a question that came from those following us online, and it says, what is the Biden administration doing to help get American mining companies access to copper and critical cobalt resources there in Africa to help address national security needs? Well, I guess I should turn that to you, Helena, and then we'll return to the Governor General.
Sure. So I think that if you're gleaning one thing from this conversation today is that our approach is really born in partnership around these economic issues, around more than the mining sector. And, we should say that to date on the corridor, we have not individually invested yet in a mining project, although I'm sure we will. The few projects we have started our initial assessment on happen to be processing projects. So why does that matter, and why does it matter for the mining sector? One thing that we hear from any private entity that wants to enter the market is, all the stuff we talked about today, things that we can do to support them more. But it's also the predictability of institutions in the countries that they're trying to operate in. And I think we had a really robust conversation around that. What we're doing with our investment in logistics, in warehousing, in this connectivity that supports multiple commodities, critical minerals, and other, is with our partners offering assurances to U.S. mining companies that a few things are going to happen. One, that the U.S. government is going to be there to stay. These investments take a really long time, and part of the reason why we picked private partners to do this work is to offer that assurances so we can raise money for these projects, that we, of course, can assure our African partners, but we also can assure the private sector that the support that is born around them is as enduring as it can be. We all can't, predict every governmental change. We can't predict every change in regulation, but what we can do is be really clear about what we're going to do and where we're going. The second thing is, one of the biggest costs that are born of these projects is figuring out how to evacuate them, how to actually work within the ecosystem of what will be new rules, as we see, right, of beneficiation on the continent. So to have some of that pre-navigated, I think, is quite beneficial. But we still have a journey to go on, and we're seeing more Western companies looking at either initial entry or re-entry into the continent in a very cautiously optimistic way. And I see some smiles in the audience. It's going to take some time, but we're seeing all sorts of new types of companies, whether it's companies like Cobalt in Zambia that are testing out different types of models, not just on, a really important footprint and relationship with the government, but testing out different ways to use AI and predictive analytics and exploration. These are the types of companies we want to see support, and we're seeing lots of companies that the continent is comfortable with and remembers from previous times, curious about coming in. But this will all take time. I think these are just really some of the initial steps in getting us there.
We're going to have to close in about 3 minutes, but I'll take one more question from out there, then return to Dr. Fayemi, and then I'll round up. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Milky Bekele. I'm here on behalf of Search for Common Ground, which is the largest dedicated peacebuilding organization. My question for the panelists is piggybacking off of the linkages between the private sector and investing in African local communities. I want to ask, are the investments and extraction businesses conflict sensitive? And are potential drivers of conflict, or are there opportunities to engage with civil society members taken into account in these processes?
Okay, I think I manage just one more, Okay, yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Sujulipuri, and my question is, how can the international community collaborate to strengthen Africa's infrastructure, service delivery, and distribution networks to protect the critical mineral supply chains from the impacts of climate change, political instability, and debt, while making sure that there's good legal frameworks in place for resource management, given all of this could potentially collapse if all these various factors impacted the continent at the same time?
Well, thank you. I'm going to ask Dr. Fayemi to kind of try and respond to those. Again, bear in mind the point raised earlier about sovereign wealth funds. Botswana provide us a very interesting sense of the whole idea of a future fund. The fact that these are gifts to all generations that sometimes in some places one generation is squandering. Just take all of that into account and give us a sense for where we should be going.
Well, not just Botswana. I mean, your own country actually has a component of its sovereign wealth fund as a future fund. I mean, the former Minister of Finance is quietly.
We should put more money in there.
We certainly should, but at least in terms of the principle, it already exists. But let me start with the last question by the gentleman on what the international community should do. As a matter of fact, just 2 days ago, the UN Secretary General released a report on this, on guiding principles on how to manage critical minerals. And of course, it covers the entire gamut of transparency and accountability, human rights approach, a development approach, a shared economic diversification approach, all of that. I think about 10 principles, and it goes into a lot of details. You can Google their website and find some more information on that special committee that the SG set up to look into that. But there are broader issues that have been raised. First, around sovereign wealth fund as a tool to use for this. I think we need to even go beyond sovereign wealth fund, but that's clearly something that we must look at how it can provide better resources, particularly for infrastructure financing. I mean, the whole point that she made about that, I can't fault. However, we need to think outside the box when we're talking about these sovereign funds. I mean, you have Nasarawa State, for example, with all these huge potentials for raising these resources. But Nasarawa State cannot raise funds because it's not a sovereign. It's a sub-sovereign. I believe we have now reached a point where multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, African Development, all of these institutions need to start looking at creating access for subnationals. Some subnationals are bigger than so-called sovereigns.
Yes.
And there should be a potential for such funds to exist with all of the de-risking facilities that it will require, so that you don't have to jump the hoops of going through a national that is a sovereign, that is not interested in exploiting the resources that are in your domain. I mean, if you look at this country, Texas can raise funds
Yep.
for exploiting its resources without necessarily having to come to Washington to do that. Maybe that's a question that we need to reflect on. But on the Moroccan question, you are absolutely right. As a matter of fact, it points to the duplicity that we see in the international environment. If that initiative had been enthusiastically supported, the Moroccan-Nigerian gas pipeline covering about 11, 12 countries, at the time that the crisis that affected the Nord Stream pipeline from Germany to Russia, bringing gas to Europe, occurred over the Ukrainian war, that would have been there to provide transition energy of gas going to Europe. But I am not sure any other country outside of those two countries, Nigeria and Morocco, are funding that project that you're talking about. They're the only two countries funding it. But this is a project that is going to benefit Europe a lot more extensively and provide an alternative source of energy from the gas resources that Governor Sule talked about by the time it's completed. That has also happened. There's also a West African gas project initiative as well, not just the Nigerian-Algeria gas project. So I think it's important to see how these critical infrastructures can be developed on a pan-African basis in order to accomplish that mining vision that the African Union has highlighted. But at the local level too, these partnerships are important. When I was minister, we were able to accomplish one major project because the governor that I dealt with, the governor of Kaduna State, could see the point of what we wanted to do when we gave a license to this private company to develop the African Steel Project. We've had a national steel project that has been comatose for 40 years, never started, the Ajaokuta Steel Project. And now that project that I'm talking about that we licensed in 2017 has started work in Kaduna State, in Gujeni village. This African steel project producing almost 1.5 million of steel.
Okay.
And this is something that just started in 2017. Our Ajaokuta Steel Project that is of the same capacity of 1.5 million has not been off the ground for 50 years. That's something that is run by...
After $10 billion. Okay.
So I think different approaches can be used, but also there are other creative approaches. In Nigeria, we set up the Studied Mineral Development Fund. There is also the Natural Resource Development Fund in the Nigerian revenue sharing formula, which focuses primarily on initiatives around mining, around agriculture, around water resources. That's about 1.5% of our revenue that is supposed to go into that. Whether it is used effectively to accomplish the objective of developing those associated infrastructure is a different matter. But in terms of creative mechanisms and approaches, I think we need to look at that. And finally, because in Africa, the bulk of the mining that occurs is artisanal and small scale. We need to figure out how to ensure that in enabling, the people that Governor Sule was talking about collecting 200 million for what could literally bring billions of dollars.
It will cause problems in the community.
we need to set up frameworks that would also give communities some ownership.
Sure, very important.
And sense of belonging. And I think it responds to that question about conflict sensitivity in the local communities. Because what tends to create conflict is when people feel excluded and they think these resources belong to us. We have not been taken into account about it.
Right.
So initiatives like EITI, Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which many African countries are part of,
Well,
I've also looked into that. In fact, you should have grabbed the former minister who was executive secretary of NITI in Nigeria, sitting quietly to talk about that. So, but,
Well, thank you also so very much. This has been very, very enriching for me. And I take the possibilities that are there that were put forward by Ms. Wanawasa. Narratives may seem not so bright, but the possibilities are extremely bright. And I think that if we look at things that have happened, we're talking about Morocco, Tangier Med gives a sense for the possibilities for Africa.
absolutely.
And the more we work together on that continent, the more we find partners outside. I'm one who's argued that we should find a company like Marubeni to partner with a group of the African private sector. We had the West African Enterprise Network like 30, 40 years ago, supported from here by USAID, bring together a network of African young entrepreneurs, West African for that particular, and they go into investments with a company like a Marubeni to do aggregating across borders. And the infrastructure that would then drive the seamlessness of such aggregation will lead to a takeoff on the continent. So I'm hopeful for the kinds of contributions that we have seen made here, especially if we go back to the supply chain crisis that COVID showed us. The need to diversify for this planet is so much more. And I thank you for being part of this conversation.